Hi, everybody. This is lecture number 4. We're going to talk about the commissioner's plan today. And before we get into the slides, I want to just go over the schedule for the next couple of weeks really quick. So we're looking at the commissioner's plan today. And you have a reading report due today, reading report number 2 about the commissioner's plan, the map of 1811, and the remarks of the commissioners. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. For next week, you have the John Randall memoir from Valentine's Manual, and also the Randall farm maps to explore. So that will be the subject of reading report number 3. And then later today at 1:30, I'm going to meet with group 5 right here, and group 6 at 2 o'clock today. And then looking ahead for the next couple of weeks, next week, March 5th, we'll talk about the Croton Aqueduct. And then the following week, March 12th, we'll talk about Central Park. And then on March 19th, you have a midterm exam, which will be due on March 19th. It's a take-home exam, and I will do a midterm exam review on March 12th. Okay, let's talk about the commissioner's plan. So you've already learned about this because it's in the Manhattan and Maps reading. So let's look at this map, which you'll remember, this is the Montresor plan from 1766. This is a detail where you can kind of see what the city looked like in the years before the American Revolution. And we have the Common right here. We have Broadway coming to a dead end. This street is the Bowery, which is still there today, Bowery. And then we have all the farmland out here. And the city is gradually expanding, but pretty slowly. This is the Collect Pond. And this is the Lispenard's Meadows, which figures in the reading for next week, the John Randall memoir. He talks about that. He mentions it anyway. He mentions crossing over it. So this is all a salt marsh, and you can see the topography here is indicated. So this would be higher land here, sloping down. And this is here's a windmill. That's the Bayard Estates windmill. This is the Bayard estate here. This is James Delancey's estate over on the other side of the Bowery. Delancey sympathized with the British Crown during the Revolution. So after the war, his land was all confiscated by the Americans. Here's another windmill down here. And this was also, you can see here, it's kind of hard to read, but it says Jews burying ground. So this was a cemetery for the few, very small contingent of Jewish people who were living in the city at that point. There was another burying ground right about here, although it's not marked on this map, right about there, just north of the Commons, which at the time was called, this was the title of it at the time, was the Negroes Burying Ground. Today we call it the African Burial Ground. And that has a long, interesting history with its rediscovery in the early 1990s. So there were burying grounds here and there right here off the Bowery, this says rope walk. Does anybody know what a rope walk is? A rope walk was a rope factory, and they were long and skinny because that's how they made rope. They had to have a lot of distance to tie up the pieces of hemp to make rope. So that's the Montresor plan, 1760s. You can see the reason I mentioned it here in relationship to the commissioner's plan is that you can see the city is gradually extending past what had been the colonial footprint. You can see these are all city blocks here. Trinity Church has laid out some blocks here, but still it's really small, and the rest of the island was farmland and villages. Then we have this map. Hope you remember the name of this one. This is from 1789, so right a few years after the Revolution. Here again is the Commons. Here's the Bowery. Going north into the city, we still had a lot of farmland here, but here you can see the Delancey estate has been opened as streets, as a grid of streets. And so the city is gradually getting bigger, but you can see that the development is not really cohesive. There's the Delancey grid up here, there's the Trinity grid over here, and there's the leftovers from the Dutch colony as well. There's all those winding streets. So no cohesive city plan at this point. And the city is growing rapidly after the war. So 1790, which is 7 years after the war ends, the population is only 33,000. 10 years later, it's almost doubled. And then by 1810, it's already up to almost 100,000 people. So there was a tremendous growth in population following the Revolutionary War. So this is the commissioner's plan. This is the bottom of the drawing that you're looking at from 1811. So 1810, almost 100,000 people. This was produced during that time and issued 1 year later in 1811. And it includes the entire island of Manhattan, including the part that the commissioners didn't touch. So from the Montresor plan, 1766, all the way to the commissioner's plan, you can see how much the city has grown. So we're looking right now at everything south of this line. Everything north of this line is the commissioner's plan, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I want you to see what the city looked like south of that point. You can see that since the city directory plan and the Montresor plan, how much the city has grown, and you can also see how there's no coherence to it. So there are all these competing grids that are being laid out with no overall plan in mind. So the city has grown along the water's edge here. You can see also here, there's another grid that doesn't agree with it. Then this grid was laid out on the old Bayard estate after the Bayard family, after the last patriarch died, and his descendants broke up the land and laid out these streets. This is modern day Soho. And then here's Greenwich Village up here, which on earlier maps was a separate village. And now it's become just part of the city, really. And then down here, we can see here's the land, down here, the land owned by Trinity Church. So it's growing, definitely growing, but with no real order to it. So we started looking at the first city map we looked at was the Costello plan from 1665. So just for some comparison, so here's the city as it looked in 1811, minus this part up here. So this part wasn't there yet. The commissioner's plan wasn't there yet. This is just drawn as a what if for this is what they're proposing north of here. But everything south of that line was existing in 1811. So the Costello plan, if you recall, what that looked like. That was just this part of the city, right about like this. Actually, it was just like that. So that's the area of the Costello plan down here. So by 1811, you can see they've added some blocks here to extend the city. Likewise on the west side. And likewise here. So Battery Park has been extended. And then the Montresor plan would have shown the Commons, which was here. And here's Trinity Church, and here's St. Paul's Chapel. Those were on that earlier map. And here is Broadway, extending north. So you can see that by 1811, Broadway extends across what had been Lisbonard's Meadows, which by this time, 1811, has been covered over. It's still under a culvert, but Canal Street has been built on top of it, which is right there. The Bowery is still there, going into the north, but you can see all the farmland that it used to pass through is gone. So all of these are now city blocks. Oh, and here's the other thing I wanted to show you on here is City Hall. City Hall is right there. So we talked a lot about that last week. So City Hall, the original idea was that it would be in the center of the city, but you can see that by 1811, it's already now, the city is passing it in a hurry. And these streets were laid out, but they weren't built up with buildings. There were very few buildings on them at this point. So City Hall still really was in the center of the action, as it were, but the city is rapidly moving past City Hall. So in this context of runaway development and skyrocketing population, an important figure steps onto the scene. And there's tons of politicians and people in the history of New York City. They don't all relate exactly to what we're doing, but this guy really does, because he had a drastic impact on the city's built environment. And this is DeWitt Clinton. He was the mayor of the city 3 separate times. He served 3 separate terms, and also served 2 separate terms as governor. He also was the Federalist Party nominee for president, United States president. In 1812, he lost to James Madison. So he was almost president of the United States. But as mayor and governor, he had a profound impact on New York's built environment. So in 1807, and this is all described in the reading that you're doing on the commissioner's plan, the remarks of the commissioners. 1807, so this is when DeWitt Clinton is governor. When DeWitt Clinton is mayor. He's in the last year of his first of 3 terms as mayor of the city. The city petitions the state legislature to step in and come up with a plan for this that will govern the city's development in the future, and as it turns out, over the next century. They didn't specify exactly what they wanted the legislature to do, but the legislature knew what the city needed and what they had in mind. And no doubt Clinton was lobbying the legislature to create this commission. And so in 1807, the legislature creates the so-called Commission on Streets and Roads, and appoints 3 people to act as commissioners to come up with a plan to govern how streets are opened and closed, how the city proceeds to develop as it's growing. And in the reading you're doing, in the introduction to the remarks, the author, whoever he is, it's unsigned, talks about why this happened in more detail. And I'll go over that in a second. So the three commissioners are Governor Morris. So his name is Governor. It's not that he was a governor of anything. That was a name back then that you don't see very much anymore. Spelled different. Governor Morris, Simeon DeWitt, and John Rutherford. So Morris was a well-known politician. He had been United States Senator from New York. He was one of the founding fathers. He was the one who drafted the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, the famous "We the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union," et cetera, et cetera. That was him. He wrote that. So he was one of the founding fathers. He was a lawyer, friend of Alexander Hamilton. He was the one who delivered the eulogy at Hamilton's funeral. So he was very famous, and so he became the head of this commission. John Rutherford on your right there, it's spelled F-U-R-D. In the reading, they misspell it F-O-R-D, but it's John Rutherford with two U's. Rutherford had been a United States Senator from New Jersey. He was a friend of Morris. So he was a politician, also a lawyer, also a surveyor. DeWitt Clinton was also a surveyor. People did a lot of different things back then. Rutherford was kind of nearing the end of his career, so he wasn't as involved in this commission as the other two were. Apparently he missed a lot of meetings and things like that. So he was kind of a minor part of this, but it's important to remember his name and who he was. And then the middle person there is Simeon DeWitt, and he was kind of, he's really important because for a couple of reasons. He was the Surveyor General of New York State. He was probably the most well-known surveyor in the country at that point. He had served in the Revolutionary War as George Washington's head surveyor, and having accurate maps was really important during the war. And Simeon DeWitt is really important also to the commissioner's plan because he was from Albany and he had a protege who was John Randall Jr., a young, much younger surveyor. And so it was DeWitt who brings Randall into the project as the so-called secretary and surveyor to the commission. So he's working for the three-person commission, and he's the one who's actually going to do the legwork on the project, actually going to be the one who designs and builds the equipment to survey the island. He's the one who hires a crew of surveyors to assist him with laying out the grid on the island. So he's the one who actually did the grunt work. And he's the one who had to make all this happen, and he's the one who drew the maps. He was 21 years old when he starts working on this in 1808. So this is a picture, a portrait of him as a young man, and this is when he was older. He's such a fascinating character, John Randall. Lately, he's been getting kind of more attention, which is great because for years he's been a really obscure figure. He really should be credited with devising modern Manhattan. He was the one who actually walked the entire island back and forth, getting harassed by people and arrested even for trespassing, and just so incredibly talented as a map maker, as you'll see with the farm maps. Oh my God. And so incredibly obsessive and so precise in all his measurements. These are the measurements that he did. So this is now 200 years ago, over 200 years ago. The measurements that he took on the island now are still absolutely accurate. The surveyors today have looked at what he's done. He left behind field notes of all his measurements and everything he did. And they're amazed at what he was able to accomplish. And he designed and built all his own equipment. Incredibly talented guy. There's a book that came out a few years ago about him. I meant to show that to you. Hold on a second. It's in the other room. I'll be right back. This is a book called The Measure of Manhattan, by Marguerite Holloway. And it's basically a biography of John Randall. There you can see him on the cover. And it's all about how he went about doing the commissioner's plan and about his later endeavors too. So that's a really good read if you want to check that out. And so for next week, you're going to be reading his memoir that he wrote some years after, some 30 years later, kind of talking about the process he went through working for the commissioners, coming up with these plans. He's a really temperamental character. He had a real temper. He was always suing people in his career. He was always getting into very public conflicts, arguments in newspapers back and forth. In Manhattan and Maps, you read already about this conflict he got in with the map maker, William Bridges, where Bridges basically took Randall's work and issued it under his own name, which is plagiarism, and it should have been a copyright infringement. And then Randall couldn't stand that, and he fought that tooth and nail, and ultimately issued his own map. And then much later, in 1820, issued the Farm Maps, which is widely considered his masterpiece and the masterpiece of American cartography from this era, from the early 19th century. But he complained endlessly about the work that he had to do on the commissioner's plan. He said that the time that he was allowed was barely sufficient, which is totally true. He starts in 1808. He has to finish by I think he finished the measurements in 1810, and then draws the map, which is issued in the spring of 1811. So just a huge endeavor with very little time. He always complained that his surveyors got drunk and wouldn't show up for work, and that he didn't have the necessary support. At one point, his horse is stolen. He has to try to find his horse, and he's got problems with his family upstate. All of this is described in The Measure of Manhattan, if you want to check that out. He's such an interesting character. So there are multiple versions of the commissioner's plan, which you would already know from reading Manhattan and Maps. There's the 1811 version, which we're going to look at now. There's the 1814 version, the 1821 version, and then the 1820 Farm Maps as well. So the first version was published in 1811 and had the remarks, this report that the commissioners wrote along with it. So when you're studying this, you really got to look at the 1811 map and read the remarks so you can see how they justified what they were doing. So there were 155 streets, and the streets run this way, east and west this way, and then the avenues run north and south. Please don't, on a report or an exam, please don't say that the avenues run vertically. Everybody was saying that last year. Streets don't run vertically. They're all horizontal. It's just that some run east-west, some run north-south. So please don't say horizontal and vertical, because that's doesn't happen. So there's 155 streets, and then there were 12 avenues. But because of the Lower East Side, it kind of juts out into the East River. The commissioners added 4 little short avenues, which were labeled Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, and Avenue D, which are still there today, and that's today's Alphabet City. The streets were 60 feet wide. The avenues were 100 feet wide, but some of the streets were also 100 feet wide. So the reading for today that you're doing, and at this point, probably most of you have already written this report, but if you haven't, this might help you. Both of these are links that I sent you. I think I just sent you the PDF of the 1811 map, the plan. So you should look at those. Let's look at the remarks for a second. So this is a website, and it's divided into an introduction, which is this part, which is not signed by any author. And then it ends right at this line right here. And then after that begins the actual document written by the commissioners that they turned in 1811. So there are two parts to this reading. You can see it's not very long. Because there are two parts, if you quote from either part, you should distinguish between whether you're quoting from the introduction or the remarks themselves. It's a website, so there are no page numbers, so you don't have to include page numbers. And we don't know who the author is of the introduction, so you can't include his or her name either, but you should distinguish between whether you're quoting from, either quoting from or drawing information from the introduction or the remarks themselves. So for citations, you can just either do a footnote and say introduction to remarks, or if it's from the remarks themselves, just say remarks, and I'll understand what you mean. Or you could, if you want to be fancy, you can say Morris, DeWitt, and Rutherford, comma, remarks, because they are the authors of the actual remarks. So that's fine. And as long as we're looking at this, you know, when you're citing sources, if you say something like, if you pull a quote directly from it, if you say, for instance, while the city's jurisdiction over the common lands was absolute, its power is yada yada. If you're literally pulling that out of the text, then you have to have quotes around it. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. But you could paraphrase. But if there's something that's really particular information that we don't all just kind of carry it around in our head, like this part here, in 1789, 9 purchasers bought just under 200 acres for about $70 an acre. Well, that's all very particular information. 1789, how many were there? 9. How many acres did they buy? 200. What did they pay? $70 an acre. I mean, that's all very fine-grained information that that we don't, it's not just common knowledge, right? So even if you paraphrase something like that, you should definitely still include a footnote or an insight citation. Okay, so the introduction here is short, and it's good because it includes the backstory of how they got hired to do this work and some of the restrictions. One of the most interesting ones here which is that there were avenues existing already. So there was, it's described in this paragraph here. And also here, sorry. So, oh, sorry, right up here. So there were roads already laid out. So here the middle road became what is today 5th Avenue. And then likewise here, there were 2 additional roads laid out prior to the commissioner's plan. And so those became Park Avenue or 4th Avenue and 6th Avenue. So that means that 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue, and 6th Avenue were already there before the commissioners started working. And those 3 north-south avenues really set the template for the rest of the commissioner's plan. And what they're talking about in this introduction is that the commissioners, it would have been very difficult to do anything that didn't involve those 3 avenues in a continuation of that kind of grid that had already been started in the middle part of the island in the 1790s. So that's interesting. And this author, whoever he or she is, says that it's interesting that in the remarks, they don't talk about that. They sort of treat the commissioner's plan like it just kind of appeared and that they invented everything when in fact they based it off of 4th, 5th, and 6th Avenues. Okay, so then that's the introduction, and then this is the remarks themselves. And what they're doing here is justifying their work, because what they're proposing, a grid on most of the island of Manhattan, was really radical and was controversial, and they knew they were going to get a lot of opposition from landowners. Imagine if you owned a house that was going to be in the middle of a new avenue or street. You would have to move it or it would get destroyed. People's land was going to be cut up and subdivided. And so they knew this was going to be controversial. So what they're doing here is trying to justify what they're doing. And there's some really famous quotes here that you need to be familiar with. And one of them is here in this 3rd paragraph. They say, one of the first objects which claimed their attention, meaning the commissioners, so our attention, one of the first objects which claimed our attention was the form in which the business, meaning the plan, should be conducted, meaning laid out. That is to say, whether we should confine ourselves to rectangular streets, which is what they ended up doing, or whether we should adopt some of those supposed improvements like circles, ovals, and stars, which certainly embellish a plan, whatever may be their effect as to convenience and utility, meaning it would look nice, but maybe not be so practical. And no doubt what they're talking about here and criticizing is Washington, D.C., which at that point had just been laid out by the French engineer L'Enfant. And Washington, D.C. had a bunch of diagonals and squares, and it was really inventive city plan. What the commissioners in New York were proposing was something much more utilitarian and uniform. And so they say, in considering that subject, we could not but bear in mind, and this is really a famous quote of theirs, that a city should be composed principally of the habitations of men, women go unmentioned, and that straight-sided and right-angled houses are the most cheap to build and the most convenient to live in. Totally debatable. The price of a house can be whatever you make it. It doesn't matter if it's right-angled or not. You can make a really cheap octagonal house or a really expensive right-angled house. Are they the most convenient to live in? It would depend on the house, wouldn't it? So that's kind of a stretch, but that was their rationale. Pretty arrogant, actually, I think, but that's how they chose to rationalize the grid. So then they go on continuing to explain it. And here's another famous part here. It may be to many a matter of surprise that so few vacant spaces have been left, and the ones that we did do are so small for the benefit of fresh air and preservation of health. So what they're talking about there is the fact that the grid did not really have a lot of public spaces. They pretty much carved up the whole island into real estate, into building lots that could be bought and sold. And that was what they were trying to do. They were trying to turn Manhattan into a marketplace for real estate. And they were trying to make it regular so that roughly everybody had kind of the same size lots. And they didn't take land from landowners. It wasn't that radical. So if you were a landowner who owned 40 acres, that was great because now you owned a big chunk of modern day Manhattan. So a lot of those landowners that had a lot of money were thrilled by this plan because it meant that they had a lot of real estate to sell. So the commissioners didn't take land. That's an important point to make. But they did chop it up into these parcels of real estate. And those parcels were uniform, as we'll see in a few minutes. So they're saying, well, you know, we didn't leave a lot of space. And then they say, well, but, you know, New York has 2 river edges. And so if it was somewhere else on a small stream, maybe we would need more public spaces. But they call the East River and the Hudson the large arms of the sea, which embrace Manhattan. And they're basically saying, well, it's healthy enough. We don't need a lot of open space. So they did include some public spaces, which we'll look at in a second. But it wasn't a big priority for them, open space. And then, so they're talking about different spaces that they laid out, like including a market, and that was never built. And then the third really famous passage from the remarks is this one, where they talk about why they didn't continue all the way up to the very tip of the island. So they stop it right about just north of where City College is, and they didn't go further. And so here they're explaining why. So they went up to 155th Street and then they stopped. The modern city above 155th Street, that was all added later. In some cases, much later. Like Inwood, for instance, wasn't laid out until I think the very late 19th century, early 20th century. So here they're defending their decision to stop the grid and not go up the entire way. So they say, to some it may be a matter of surprise that the whole island hasn't been laid out as a city. To others, it may be a subject of merriment that the commissioners have provided space for a greater population than is collected at any spot on this side of China. So they're saying, some of you may have wanted us to continue and you're surprised that we stopped. Others will think that we did way too much, and there's no way that the streets that we've laid out are ever going to be occupied anytime soon. We've left enough space for a bigger population, almost as big of a population as China. So here they say they, meaning we have been governed by the shape of the ground. It is not improbable that considerable numbers may be collected at Harlem, numbers of people, before the high hills to the southward of it shall ever be built on as a city. It is improbable that for centuries to come, the north ground of Harlem Flats will be covered with houses. So they're saying we've done so much that for centuries to come, the ground north of Harlem, the land north of Harlem, will not be occupied by very many people. So they were thinking that the city is growing, they provided a plan for growth, but it's never going to grow to the extent that that people will actually be living on 154th, 155th Street. Not for centuries. And then they say, finally, to have come short of the extent laid out might have defeated the city and the state legislature's expectations. You didn't do enough. Why? We hired you and you didn't lay out enough streets. But to have gone further might have furnished materials to the pernicious spirit of speculation. So speculation is basically, Wall Street is speculation, real estate is speculation, where you buy something, you're hoping the price will rise so that you can sell it for a higher price. So that's basically how the stock market works. And it's how real estate works, especially in New York. So somebody buys a house and they hang on to it and they hope the price goes up so they can flip it and make a profit. That's been the story of New York since the very beginning. So it's ironic that they say, well, we didn't want to go past 155th Street because we didn't want to unleash these forces of speculation. Well, that's ridiculous, because the whole reason they're doing the plan is to cut the whole island into parcels of real estate that can be bought and sold. So that totally doesn't hold water, that argument. But the other parts, and the thing about for centuries to come, about it growing, that it won't fill up, it was probably a good prediction, but as we'll see, that they had no idea how much the city was going to grow. So that's reasonable, but they were just wrong about it. But the first reason was they've been governed by the shape of the ground, and that is valid because north of 155th Street and even south of it, the island is getting really pretty hilly. And they weren't concerned with nuance and topography. They just inserted a grid onto the island. And they didn't really think, they thought about the section, but they didn't really worry too much about it. And it would have been really difficult, if not impossible, to superimpose this two-dimensional grid onto the terrain in northern Manhattan. So they didn't try, so they stopped. So those are important for you to think about and remember, these three reasons: the fact that the topography is one, it was too hilly, that they didn't think the city was going to grow as fast as it did, and then they didn't want the island to turn into a real estate market where people were buying and selling and flipping land for the best price. But of course, that's exactly what it was already. The rest of the reading is getting into details about where things are located relative to the things that were there before, which is interesting since so many of these earlier landmarks have disappeared. Okay, so those are the remarks. Oh, there. My mouse died for a second. Sorry, now I gotta find my way back to the PowerPoint. Oh, there it is. So one of the criticisms of the commissioner's plan that you still read a lot today is that they did it, they basically did it, they should have tilted the whole thing 90 degrees. That their plan didn't make sense because they had so many cross streets, east-west cross streets, and so few north-south avenues, that really they should have flipped it and had it have a ton of north-south avenues and comparatively fewer east-west streets. It would have been easier then to travel up and down the island, and that does make sense. But what they did have a logic. They didn't make a mistake. They included all of these east-west streets, I think because at this point, business was all based on water because roads weren't very good at this point. So shipping was critical to the economy. And I think they laid them out this way with all of these east-west streets so that each street in theory could have a dock at the end of it. And ships could come in and load and unload on every single one of these streets. So I think that's the reason they did it. These are just some details from the 1811 plan. And so this was drawn by John Randall, and he's drawing the grid as solid lines, and then everything that was underneath as a dotted line is the existing fabric of the city, which is going to be superseded by the new grid. And so you can look at this in some detail in the PDF I sent you, and it's pretty astonishing everything that they got rid of, that they didn't even try to incorporate. So you can see over and over again, roads that were erased, villages that were erased. Here's the village of Manhattanville. And over again, you can see buildings that coincide with one of the new avenues or roads, which means that they would have to move out of the way or get destroyed. This is on the east side, Kips Bay. This is interesting because you can see underneath the new grid that there was a grid already there, but it wasn't exactly lining up, so that got erased. And this is the precursor of today's Union Square. And in John Randall's memoir that you're reading for next week, he talks about the difficulty of trying to design this and how this came about. It was called Union because it was the place where Broadway and the Bowery came together, where they formed a union. And they couldn't resolve all of these existing roads, so they just left the space open and called it Union Place. And it eventually got built as Union Square, but not in the same spot. So eventually it gets built. Let's see if I can draw something like right here. It's not the right shape. Something like that. Oh, there's Peter Stuyvesant's house. Not the same Peter Stuyvesant, but I think his would have been his grandson, I think, at that point, Peter Stuyvesant. That's his house. So he's including all the names of the landowners. So some of these people were pretty prominent. This is, I forget his first name, Spingler was pretty prominent. So this is the bottom part of the map, which I showed you earlier, where Randall is including the existing fabric of the city, which is everything south of this line, which is, this is Houston Street, and it follows the Bowery over to the Village. And so everything north of that line is where they started working. So they start at First Street, which is right here, and First Avenue right here. So this is kind of like the origin point of the commissioner's plan. Here you can see this is Avenue A, B, C, D, and then you go Second Avenue, Third Avenue, here's Broadway, etc. And then from this point north, they just kind of set out this uniform grid all the way up to 155th Street. Here's the middle part of the island. This is going from, here's 57th Street down here, all the way up to 111th Street. And between 110th, 8th, all the way down to 59th, 8th, 7th, 6th, and up 5th. This whole area in this rectangle here, who can guess what that became eventually and is not included in this map? I bet you can guess. And the place where it is today, you'll see that, so Randall still staked out all the points for these streets and avenues. He talks about this in his memoir. He took his crew of drunk surveyors and they would go out every day and they would measure points. And then when they came up with a new intersection, they would mark it either with a marble monument that they would drive in to the earth, pretty tall marble monument. I think it was maybe 5 feet high or something like that, and about this big around. If it was in a rock and they couldn't do it, they would drill a hole in the rock and put in a metal bolt. And so this whole part of the city, this whole part of the grid in here was never built for reasons I'm sure you've guessed by now. And, but he still put all the monuments there. And astonishingly, I think, some of them are still there and have recently been discovered, especially in the northern part here. They've been uncovered, so they've been discovered lately. It's really cool. Then you can also see here that there are some public spaces that they laid out. Here's Hamilton Square. Here's Observatory Place. Here's, this is just called Harlem Marsh. And there were other ones. So here's Manhattan Square. So they had an idea that there should be open spaces once in a while on the grid, but it's really kind of a minor part of it. And these weren't really conceived as public parks in the modern sense. They were just kind of places where people could go to get fresh air, for the circulation of air. This was a time of annual yellow fever epidemics, and so they were trying to just get air moving. But none of these ended up being built except for Manhattan Square right here. That was built, and there's a museum on it today. Maybe you can figure out what museum would be there, between 81st and 77th on 8th Avenue. Then here's where the grid ends. Here's 155th Street, and that's beyond the point where they didn't want to continue. So this remains north of 155th Street, remains undeveloped until after the Civil War, where it's developed initially as kind of a suburb, and then in the early 20th century, when the subway was extended up to those parts, then the city filled in, it became urban. So in John Randall's memoir that you're reading for next week, it's basically a big defense of the plan that he helped to draw. And he's saying that it greatly enhanced property values on the island. Well, yeah, it really did. It kind of turned the saleable land in Manhattan from something that was measured in acres, like farmland measured in acres, to something that's measured in feet. And here you can see a standard city block in the grid. This is between 4th Street and 3rd Street, 1st Avenue and 2nd Avenue. And you can see how then it followed then that each of these blocks would be subdivided into parcels of real estate. And those were standardized for the most part. And so and this persists to today. So here's like a standard building lot, which you can see would include the building on part of the lot, and then the backyard would be open. And this was a model that had already existed in Manhattan and elsewhere. And sometimes they had a building built in the back too. But generally the model was building in front, backyard in the back, fenced in. And the standard dimension for a lot was 25 by 100. So generally this would be 100 feet this way. Oops. And then here would be 25. I mean, there are variations, but that became like the standard New York City lot dimension, which means that this block from here to here between the streets is 200 feet. The dimension this way varies, as you'll see if you look at the 1811 plan. This is not always a consistent dimension. So the plan is issued in 1811 at a time of drastic growth in the city. And the city continues to grow. And so they were absolutely right in their prediction that they needed a consistent, cohesive plan for the city, because the people were coming, and there were a lot of reasons that people were coming. New York was quickly becoming the chief exporter of cotton from the South and importer of manufactured goods from Europe. So it was quickly becoming the pivot point. And then at this point, the Erie Canal is under construction. That's going to open up easier access to markets in the West for New York. So in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. So people were coming because there were jobs in importing and exporting. There was a building boom going on. So there were carpenters were needed, and builders and every accountants, every profession you can imagine was needed. So people were flooding into the city. So much so that by 1820, when Randall finishes the farm maps, the city is already up to over 150,000 people. The farm maps. Oh my God. I love the farm maps. I will never get tired of looking at them. John Randall convinces the city much later, this is now almost 10 years after the 1811 plan. He convinces the city that what they really need is a more detailed plan of Manhattan, or at least the commissioner's plan part of Manhattan. And that it needs to be at a really big scale so that you can see every single building, every single fence line, orchard, everything. And so they hire him to issue this, to work on this set of new plans. He draws them on individual sheets and it ends up being 92 separate sheets. Each one is, I think, 36 by 20, something like that. And it takes him 2 years to finish them. They're in full color. He used pen and ink, pencil, and watercolor. Like the earlier maps, he includes the name of each landowner, and he includes what was underneath the plan and what's going to get erased by the new grid. So old roads and topography, creeks and streams and ponds. And then he includes in astonishing detail all of the existing buildings. No matter how small, he included everything. Randall was really obsessive, and it's to our benefit because now we can enjoy his work. You'll see here that, well, let me just show you the actual farm maps. These are just some details. This is I think this is the first one he did. This is at the very northern tip of Manhattan. Here he's showing an orchard, but let me show you the actual maps. So this is part of the reading for next class for March 5th. So you're reading a memoir that he wrote much later in 1864. And then you're exploring the farm maps of 1820. Bear with me here. All right. So here is John Randall's memoir that you're going to read. And this is at an incredible website called archive.org. If you haven't used this before, you just flip through the pages just like it's a book, just by clicking on the edge of the page. So it's a really great way to read stuff. So he's describing his work here. He says in the years 1808, 1809, 1810, while acting as secretary and surveyor to the commissioners, I went almost daily from the city to our office, then in the country, at the northeast corner of Christopher and Herring Streets. And he says, in going from the city to our office, I generally crossed a ditch cut through Lispenard's salt meadow, now a culvert under Canal Street, on a plank laid across it for a crossing place. And so he's describing, and then he says, from the crossing place, I followed a well-beaten path to the village of Greenwich. So that's really interesting. He's describing what it was like to walk north out of the city up to the village. And he had to cross Lispenard's meadows on a plank. So that was in 1808, 09, 10. And then here in another article that I didn't assign you back here, he has some beautiful little maps Greenwich Village at the time. And here you can see, this is his, up here, his office at the corner of what is now Christopher Street and Bleecker Street. That building is no longer there anymore because they, at one point, they, in the last century, they widened Bleecker Street. So that's not there anymore. And then he, describes the state of the collect pond and how it was looked when they had filled up about half of it. And he's really proud of the commissioner's plan and his work. He says that here on page 848, third paragraph, he says, this plan of the commissioners, which was objected to before its completion, is now the pride and boast of the city, and the facilities afforded by it for buying, selling, and improving real estate, etc. So he's acknowledging and bragging about how it turned the city into a real estate market. He goes into excruciating detail here about every place on the map. And this will only make sense if you kind of look at the farm maps as you're reading this. And even then, some of it won't make sense, but that's okay. He goes into obsessive detail about every measurement. But I mean, it's really interesting. Like here's a reference to Aaron Burr. There's references to Alexander Hamilton. He talks about coming across the remains of Fort Washington in Upper Manhattan. So really interesting. Let's look at the farm maps. Oops. I don't know if you guys can see that. Let me try that again. Okay, there we go. So this is a link that I sent you. The farm maps are, as I said, were 92 separate sheets, each one about this big. And when I first encountered them about 10 years ago, there's only one copy of these maps. These are all just one original copy, and they are kept in boxes in the Manhattan Borough President's office. So I went there and made an appointment, and they let me look at the actual maps. Since then, the Museum of the City of New York has digitized them and then stitched them all together. So now we can just look at them all together, which is just fantastic. Oops. So you can see here's where the maps begin down here. So it does not include the area of the city south of Houston Street and south of the Village, unlike the 1811 map. So he starts here above Houston and then includes all the same information as he did in 1811, but just in a lot more detail. So you can zoom in and dive in and look at everything. And he included notations where he put the monuments. He includes also some of his calculations about the elevation. So here you can say, it says elevation 56.54. I assume that's 56 feet. Hope I'm not making you guys too dizzy while I do this. You can do it on your own. But there's some really interesting, beautiful detail here. It's labeled New York Hospital. That's the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum. So in the original plan, you can see here that 117th Street was supposed to blow through the asylum. They didn't end up doing that. They never opened 117th over, because the directors of the hospital were complaining. So in some cases, streets weren't put through. But in other cases, like here's kind of a typical condition with a building right in the middle of 119th Street. So that would have either been torn down or more likely just moved out of the way. So all they had to do in some cases was move it a few feet just out of the path of the oncoming street. Let me just show you a couple more things. If we go up to where City College is today, this is really cool. So this house here is Alexander Hamilton's house, which is still exists today in a slightly different location right by City College. And this map is so detailed that it also includes not only the house, but here you can see it has a root house, ice house, hen house, shed, barn, and milk house over this little stream. So and you know, here's a fence. You can see the fence in excruciating detail. His wife, whose name I think was Lucretia, helped him with the map, especially when he was up against a deadline. So she also worked on it. She did a lot of the inking, and I think she did some of the lettering. But it's just one of the most beautifully drawn maps I've ever seen. And the detail is just extraordinary. And look at this part. This is in the northern part of the island, where this is one of the ruins of a Revolutionary fort that he found in this orchard. This is called Fort Prince Charles. That must have been the name after the British took it over. But look at the detail with this. He drew every single tree in this orchard and the fence. And each tree has a little shadow. I mean, my God, it's just incredible. So incredibly beautiful. So yeah, so you should just spend some time. I mean, I've been looking at these for years now. There's no end to it. So just kind of poke around and see interesting things. If you have any questions about anything that you find, definitely ask me. And again, I sent you a link for that. You can look at it. Oops. So the farm map. So then I'm almost done. I'm probably like another 5 or 10 minutes. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the effect of the commissioner's plan on the island's topography. You'll recall that there is topography in Manhattan, and there was a lot more before the commissioner's plan. This is Bayard's Mount, looking out of the Collect Pond toward the city in 1798. And that kind of rural topography was all about to get plowed under by the commissioner's plan. We looked at this the first class when I was talking about geology. This is a section cut through Broadway between the Battery and 34th Street. And you can see that, of course, it's not flat. Even now there is, this was, I think, 100 years ago. There's still now topography in the island is not flat. This is a series of sections through each of the avenues of the commissioner's plan. You can see the variety in topography. So it's not flat. So, but they didn't conceive of it as anything other than flat. Okay, so this was a big problem. So if the island is a three-dimensional landform and the grid itself is two-dimensional, those two things do not talk to each other, do they? So one analogy that I've heard, or maybe I made up this analogy, I don't remember, but that the grid, the plan itself, if you imagine it being, each block being hollow, and it's like it's made out of steel, it's kind of like a big barbecue grill or something. And if you imagine that the three-dimensional landform of the island underneath it is made out of clay, something that's kind of soft, and you imagine that here comes the plan down from outer space and it pushes into the island, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be space underneath the grid, where it doesn't push down all the way. And there's going to be other parts where the opposite happens and it cuts into the grid, which leaves little islands of land sticking up above the grid. And that's what you can see in this famous view of 2nd Avenue from 1861. So 50 years after they first proposed the commissioner's plan. And they're still laboriously trying to build all of these avenues and streets. 1811 was the first version, farm maps, or 1820, but it didn't happen overnight. It's not like they could just build all these streets and avenues on this huge island in the space of a few years. So it took most of the rest of the 19th century to finish. Well into the 1880s, 1890s, there were still streets that hadn't been opened yet. They were still trying to negotiate the grid onto this three-dimensional surface. This is a really famous image. And here you can see this would be an old farmhouse here, pre-existing the grid, and the land would have gone something like this originally. And all of this has been carved out, which leaves the house marooned above the street. And when this happened, the homeowner would have to add a temporary wooden stair, or not temporary, a wooden stair to get all the way up. Here you can see this is 2 flights up from the street to get up to the house. And there were reports that sometimes houses would just fall into these new canyons that were built. As you can imagine, movers, this was like a golden age for movers in Manhattan. This was a really profitable profession to be in at this point. There was a great demand over the next 50 years or so to move buildings out of the way when they would announce that a new avenue or street was going to open. Another point to keep in mind is that when they went to build the commissioner's plan, they didn't do it from south to north. They didn't do like 1st Street, 2nd Street. They laid it out more like a patchwork and gradually filled it in. So I think 6th Avenue and 8th Avenue and maybe 3rd Avenue went in first within 10 years of the commissioner's plan being adopted, or five years later, maybe something like that. I think 10th Avenue was an early one. And then some of the major east-west streets like 42nd Street went in. 42nd Street was one of the extra wide streets. So that was like 14th Street, 23rd Street, 34th Street, 42nd Street, 57th Street. And I think it tells in the reading, I think there are 20 of them or something. So some of those major east-west streets went in, but other streets like 84th Street didn't go in until like 1889. So, and they would happen in little pieces. So house moving was really important. Still, the city grows. So from 150,000 in 1820 to almost 250,000 people by 1830. Look at that, almost doubled just in those 10 years. From 1820 to 1830, that was a big boom in construction and population growth, much of it as a result of the opening of the Erie Canal. 1840s, Edgar Allan Poe is living in a farmhouse north of town, and he's watching all of this happen. And he writes, "I've been roaming far and wide over this island of Mannahatta. Some portions of its interior have a certain air of rocky sterility, which may impress some imaginations as simply dreary." He goes on to say he kind of liked it, but the rocky sterility, what he's talking about is this kind of landscape that you see here in this image, where they're cutting and filling to try to even out the commission, to try to reconcile the commissioner's plan with the landscape below. So here are some new streets that have been cut through and avenues, but then here's all this rubble that they have to just kind of try to push around until it more or less evens out. And it must have just kind of looked like the moon for a few decades. And then Poe makes a prediction, this is 1844 again, in some 30 years, Sorry, I can't read it. The whole island will be densely desecrated by buildings of brick with portentous facades of brownstone. He was absolutely right on the money there. And what he's predicting is this kind of construction of row houses, which had already been under construction since colonial times downtown, which was now beginning to take over the island as the grid opened up. And this is a shot of the Brennan farmhouse where Poe lived. This is 84th Street cutting through, and here you can see this is long after Poe is dead at this point, but they had to add a staircase to get up to the top. That was apparently his room right there, and that's where he wrote the poem The Raven, you know, rapping at my door, nevermore, all that. So as each decade progresses in the 19th century, now we're up to 1840, 390,000, by 1850, almost 700,000 people. So this is beginning to be kind of unimaginable growth that the commissioners of 40 years earlier never could have predicted. This is the Apthorpe Mansion on the Upper West Side. This was in 1893, I think, right before it was torn down. A lot of the old rural Manhattan was just abandoned, and a lot of it lasted for decades afterwards. So this was an 18th century mansion that was abandoned and just sat there until it was torn down. So this kind of thing happened a lot. A lot of the island was kind of just a neglected wasteland for decades as the city was developing, as more and more buildings were being built. So this is 1868, now just after the Civil War. There's a journalist from the Atlantic who hikes across the island, and he says, there's not much of the rural to be seen. A remnant of it may be discerned in some of the old mansions that stand between the railway and the river. And he was talking about mansions like the Apthorpe estate. And still, the population continues to soar. By 1860, it's over 1 million people. By 1870, almost 1.5 million people. Just continues to skyrocket. And as the grid takes over the island, they continue to blast rock to remove it. They use gunpowder. This is before dynamite was invented. So they would blast rock, the rock outcroppings, and then push the rubble into the low areas, which you can see here. This is Fifth Avenue by 117th Street around 1870. And you can see here the kind of Italianate brownstones that are being built in rows along the streets. We'll talk about that later when we talk about housing. This is a painting from around that same time called Give Us This Day Our Daily Bread, which shows work crews blasting the commissioner's plan through the city. And then here's that view that I showed you before of the old New York, the rural New York, the agrarian New York, the pastoral landscape that was eradicated by the commissioner's plan. Okay, that's the end of lecture 4. And so today I'm going to talk to group 5 at 1:30 and group 6 at 2 o'clock. I will record those meetings so the rest of you can watch them. I will put them on both YouTube and Dropbox. I'm not using Blackboard anymore. We're using it for the reading reports, but I'm not putting videos up on Blackboard anymore because it doesn't work very well and doesn't have enough space. So everything will be available on Dropbox and YouTube. And you have your second reading report due today. I opened up I adjusted the settings on Blackboard so that it will accept late papers up until Sunday, but they should be due, they're due on Friday. If you turn them in late, it's, you get deducted in points. I explain that in the syllabus, which you can check out again. So try to get them in on time, but if you can't, try to turn them in by Sunday. Okay, goodbye.